It was an ordinary afternoon when a black woman, known for her sharp mind and steady demeanor, decided to take a break from her busy schedule. She had just finished a long day at the courthouse and was on her way to the grocery store. Little did she know, her routine day was about to take a surprising turn. As she drove through a quiet neighborhood, her car was suddenly flagged down by a police officer. He stood by the side of the road, his hand raised in a gesture that made her pull over. The woman, calm and composed, rolled down her window, expecting to hear the usual license and registration routine. She had been stopped for traffic violations before and had never had an issue, so she wasn't concerned. But this time felt different. The officer, a man with light skin, approached her car with a stern look. He wasn't smiling, and there was something about his posture that suggested he was ready for a confrontation. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I pulled you over because you were speeding," he said, his tone firm, though not particularly friendly. The woman looked surprised. "I was speeding," she asked politely, unsure if she had been going too fast. She had been driving the same way for years and didn't recall breaking any laws. "I don't think I was speeding, officer," she added, trying to stay calm and respectful. The officer raised an eyebrow. "You're saying you didn't notice? Well, you were going over the limit. I'll need to see your driver's license and registration," he said, not giving her the benefit of the doubt. She sighed softly but remained composed. "Of course, officer. But I assure you, I wasn't speeding." "You can check the speedometer yourself," she replied, reaching for her purse to hand him the necessary documents. As the officer took the papers, he glanced at them quickly and then back at her. The woman could feel the tension in the air. Something about the way he was looking at her didn't seem right. She wondered if it was just the stress of his job, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was judging her in some way. Without saying much more, the officer began writing her a ticket for speeding. The woman, still trying to keep the situation calm, asked, "Is there any way to avoid the ticket? I truly believe I wasn't speeding." She didn't want to argue, but she thought it was worth asking. He didn't respond to her question immediately, but his eyes narrowed. "No, ma'am. I'm issuing the ticket," he said, still not revealing any emotion. She could tell this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. As the officer continued to write, the woman noticed that his tone was colder than it had been at the start. He wasn't rude, but his body language and the way he spoke made it clear that he wasn't about to change his mind. She remained calm, but inside, she was starting to feel a little uneasy. Still, she did her best to stay patient. She had dealt with traffic stops before and had never let her composure slip. But something told her this encounter wasn't going to end the way she expected. The officer handed her the ticket, and as she looked down at the paper, she said, "I'm a judge. I work at the courthouse." She didn't say this to impress him, but simply to offer an explanation. Maybe, just maybe, it would help the situation. The officer didn't seem to react much. He simply nodded, still with a serious expression. "That's fine. You can take it up with the court," he said, his voice still neutral. She was a judge, a respected figure in the community, and yet here she was, being treated as though she had no status at all. This wasn't how she imagined this encounter would go. She remained silent, feeling the weight of the moment. What had started as a routine stop had quickly turned into something much more tense. The woman, still holding the ticket in her hands, took a deep breath. She had remained calm throughout the interaction, but something about the officer's attitude was making her feel uneasy. She had hoped that simply telling him she was a judge would help ease the situation, but it seemed to have done little to change his behavior. Instead of showing any recognition or respect, the officer seemed determined to finish his task. The officer, now standing beside her car with his arms crossed, looked down at the ticket in his hands. His eyes flickered briefly to her face, but he didn't speak. The woman could feel the growing tension between them. She was trying to figure out what exactly had gone wrong. She knew that she had been polite and respectful, but something in the air was off. The officer's attitude suggested that he wasn't willing to listen. "Officer," she said, keeping her voice steady, I've been in law for many years. I know how traffic stops should go. I assure you, there was no speeding." The officer glanced at her briefly, but didn't respond. He just stood there, a little taller now, as if making it clear that he was the one in control. His silence was becoming more uncomfortable by the second. She felt herself growing frustrated, though she tried not to show it. She could have easily just accepted the ticket, but something about the way the officer was treating her didn't feel right. "Are you going to write me a ticket or not?" she asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. The officer finally looked back at her, his expression still stern. "Yes," he said shortly. "I'm giving you the ticket. You'll have to take it up with the court. That's how it works." She looked at him, realizing that her presence, her position, didn't seem to matter at all. He was so focused on his authority that he was blind to the reality of the situation. The officer was, at this point, so determined to prove a point that he seemed completely uninterested in hearing anything else. She couldn't let this go. "You don't know who I am, do you?" she asked, her tone calm, but now carrying a hint of frustration. The officer didn't immediately answer. He simply stared at her for a moment before responding. "It doesn't matter who you are. The rules apply to everyone. You're getting a ticket, and that's final." The woman's mind raced. This was not the kind of interaction she was used to. As a judge, she had dealt with many difficult cases and intense situations, but nothing like this. She had expected a little more respect, a little more understanding. But instead, she was being treated like any other person the officer had stopped on the road. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice remaining calm despite the tension. "Because I really don't think I was speeding. I'd hate to waste anyone's time over something that wasn't an issue in the first place." But the officer remained unmoved. "It's not about your opinion. I'm following procedure," he said, his voice now more clipped than before. At that moment, the woman began to realize that this wasn't just about a speeding ticket. It was about something much deeper. She could sense the officer's discomfort, but it wasn't coming from any professional need to be correct. It was coming from his own assumptions. He didn't know her, and he didn't seem to care to learn. She could see it now. The walls he had built in his mind, the invisible barriers that stopped him from seeing her for who she truly was. She knew that this was no longer about a ticket. It was a moment that would leave a lasting impression, not just on her, but on him as well. As the minutes passed, the situation grew more tense. The woman, still sitting in her car, kept calm, but her thoughts were racing. She couldn't understand why the officer was so determined to make this encounter uncomfortable. She had tried to explain herself politely, offering every chance for the situation to settle, but the officer remained unyielding. After what felt like an eternity, the officer suddenly reached for his radio, speaking into it with a low voice. The woman felt a strange sense of dread wash over her. He was calling for backup, and the tone of his voice made it clear that he wasn't just issuing a ticket anymore. He seemed to be preparing for something more. The woman sat still in her car, her hands resting on the steering wheel. She knew she needed to remain composed, but a small knot formed in her stomach. Something wasn't right. Was he overreacting? Did he not believe her? She had never been treated this way before, and she couldn't help but feel the injustice of the situation. As she waited, the officer turned back to her and gave a sharp nod. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice firm. It wasn't a request. It was a command. She froze. "What do you mean, step out of the vehicle?" "I'm not resisting," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady, but her confusion was obvious. "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, more forcefully now. His hand moved toward his belt, clearly prepared to escalate the situation. The woman's heart raced. "I am not getting out of the car unless you can explain why," she said, her calm tone now laced with uncertainty. She didn't understand why the officer was being so insistent. She wasn't breaking any laws, and she wasn't trying to cause any trouble, but the officer was treating her as if she were a threat. "I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction," the officer said, as if the words were automatic. His voice carried an edge, and the woman's mind whirled. How had things gotten to this point? She had done nothing wrong. Arrest? She asked, incredulously. What am I being arrested for? I haven't done anything wrong. The officer didn't respond, his face set in stone. He moved to open the car door, and the woman's body tensed. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. She had tried to stay calm, to remain respectful, but now she was being treated like a criminal. She took a slow breath, trying to keep herself from panicking. I'm a judge. I work at the courthouse, she said again, hoping this time it would sink in. She wasn't some random driver. She was someone who had earned her position through hard work and dedication. The officer looked at her briefly but didn't seem to understand the weight of her words. Instead, he simply moved forward, ready to pull her out of the car. At that moment, something inside her snapped. This wasn't just about a ticket anymore. It was about respect. She had every right to stand her ground, but she was also aware that the officer had the power to make things worse. Still, she wasn't going to let him walk over her. But as the officer reached to open the door, something changed. A second police car arrived, and a new officer stepped out. He looked at the scene quickly and then glanced at the woman. Wait. The new officer called, moving toward the first officer. He seemed to recognize something. The woman's heart skipped a beat. Could this officer finally understand who she was? The second officer approached the first one and spoke in a low voice. The first officer hesitated and looked at the woman again, this time with a flicker of doubt. It was only then that he seemed to realize the situation might not be as straightforward as he had thought. As the second officer walked closer, he took one look at the woman, his eyes widening in recognition. He stepped forward and gave a slight nod to the first officer, as if signaling that something needed to change. The woman, still in her car, held her breath. She had been through many situations in her career, but nothing like this. She had always been treated with respect because of her position, but now she felt like she was being unfairly judged. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she hoped that the arrival of this new officer would make things better. The second officer looked at the first officer, his voice calm but firm. Do you know who she is? He asked, his eyes focused on the woman. The first officer paused for a moment, glancing between his fellow officer and the woman sitting in her car. She said something about being a judge, he muttered, his voice uncertain. The second officer nodded, his expression now serious. She's a judge. She's part of the legal system. You can't arrest her like this. The words hit the first officer like a ton of bricks. His face shifted from sternness to shock. He had no idea who the woman was, and now he was beginning to understand the gravity of his actions. The reality of what had just unfolded started to sink in. The woman, still sitting in the car, felt a strange mix of emotions. She was relieved that the second officer had recognized her, but she was also frustrated. Why hadn't the first officer known who she was? She had told him, after all, and yet he had continued to escalate the situation without a second thought. The first officer stood there, clearly uncomfortable with the realization. His face flushed with embarrassment as he stepped back, no longer sure of how to handle the situation. The second officer turned to the woman and nodded respectfully. I'm very sorry for the misunderstanding, ma'am. I didn't know you were a judge. You are free to go. The woman's mind was still racing. It was hard to process what had just happened. She had been ready for an apology, but the sudden shift in the officer's demeanor didn't feel like enough. The damage had already been done. As she stepped out of the car and handed over the ticket, she knew this moment would stay with her for a long time. She would be fine, but the experience had opened her eyes to how easily things could go wrong, and how assumptions could turn into something much bigger. The second officer, now taking control of the situation, ensured the woman's safety as the first officer stood in silence, his mistake hanging in the air. The incident that had taken place between the woman and the officer quickly became a topic of discussion, not just in the local community, but across the country. What had started as a simple traffic stop had turned into a moment that would spark conversations about justice, authority, and respect. News outlets, both local and national, were quick to pick up the story. Headlines flashed across screens, catching the attention of many. People were shocked that a respected judge had been treated in such a way, simply because an officer had failed to recognize her status. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some felt sympathy for the woman, while others criticized the officer's actions. Social media buzzed with posts and comments. Many shared their own experiences of feeling judged or unfairly treated by authority figures. For some, the story felt all too familiar, a reminder of how people could sometimes be treated differently based on their race or appearance, regardless of their position or importance. Others focused on the officer's mistake, calling for more awareness and better training for law enforcement. The hashtag #RespectTheJudge quickly gained traction, with thousands of people voicing their support for the woman and criticizing the officer's handling of the situation. In the midst of all this, the woman remained quiet. She hadn't planned for her encounter with the officer to become public, and now she was being thrust into the spotlight in a way she had never expected. But despite the attention, she refused to be drawn into the frenzy. She had always believed in the importance of staying calm in difficult situations, and this was no different. Her role as a judge had always been about fairness, justice, and ensuring that everyone was treated equally under the law. But this incident showed her just how quickly things could spiral out of control when assumptions were made based on appearances. It wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a stark reminder of the biases that still existed in society. Meanwhile, the officer found himself in the center of a storm. His actions were now being scrutinized by both his peers and the public. The attention was not kind. People called for him to be held accountable for his behavior, especially considering how easily the situation could have been avoided if he had taken the time to listen. Some defended him, claiming that he was just doing his job, but the majority felt that his approach had been too harsh and dismissive. They wondered how many other similar situations had occurred that had gone unnoticed. The department soon issued a statement expressing regret over how the situation had unfolded. They acknowledged that the officer had acted without properly verifying the woman's identity and that it was an unfortunate misunderstanding. However, they also stated that they were committed to reviewing the incident and ensuring that future encounters were handled with more care and respect. The woman, while still feeling unsettled by the events, was able to find some peace in the public's reaction. She wasn't seeking attention, but she was glad that the story had sparked a much-needed conversation about how people were treated by those in authority. It wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who had ever felt dismissed or ignored because of who they were. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more questions, more discussions, and more people with opinions. But she was prepared to use her voice to make sure that this moment didn't pass without bringing about change. In the end, the public's reaction wasn't just a response to one woman's experience. It was a reflection of the growing desire for fairness, understanding, and respect in a world that still had much to learn. As the story continued to spread through the media, the woman felt the weight of it all. The news coverage, the social media posts, and the endless comments from the public made it clear that this wasn't going to fade away quickly. While some were supportive, others questioned the details, and she knew that it was important to address the situation directly. After taking some time to think, the woman decided to release a public statement. She felt it was the right thing to do, not just for herself, but for everyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. The statement was carefully crafted, clear, and composed, much like the way she had approached her work as a judge for so many years. She didn't want to stoke more anger or division. She simply wanted to speak the truth and set the record straight. Her statement began with a calm description of the events. She explained how she had been stopped by the officer, how she had tried to remain respectful, and how the situation had escalated unnecessarily. "I am a judge, a public servant committed to upholding the law," she wrote, "but that doesn't mean I am above the law. I believe in fairness, respect, and justice for all people, no matter who they are or what position they hold. She went on to address the officer's actions, not with anger, but with an appeal for understanding. I understand that officers face difficult situations every day, but we must all strive to see each other as individuals, not through the lens of assumptions or biases, she wrote. The woman knew that this wasn't just about her, but about the larger issue of how people were treated by those in power. She believed it was a crucial conversation that needed to take place. The judge also took the opportunity to reflect on the role of authority and how it should be used responsibly. It's important that we remember the duty of law enforcement to serve and protect, not only by enforcing the law, but by doing so with fairness and dignity, she stated. She called for greater awareness and sensitivity, particularly when it came to issues of race and respect. Today, I am simply a person who believes in justice, who believes in equality, and who believes that we can all do better, she concluded. I hope this experience will lead to a greater understanding between those in positions of power and the people they are sworn to protect. We all deserve respect. The statement was well received by many. Supporters praised her calmness and dignity in addressing the situation. She had used her voice to shed light on an important issue, and she had done so with grace. The response was a mix of admiration and understanding, and it helped to shift the focus back to the core message she wanted to convey: the need for respect and fairness. In the days that followed, the woman continued with her work, though the memory of that tense moment on the side of the road lingered. She knew that her statement had made a difference, but she also understood that this was just the beginning of a larger conversation. The public now had a clearer understanding of what had happened, but more importantly, they had a reminder of the importance of treating each other with dignity and respect, no matter the circumstances. The judge had used her platform to encourage others to reflect on their own actions and attitudes, making this experience a stepping stone toward greater awareness. After the woman's statement was released, the spotlight shifted from her to the officer who had been involved in the incident. The public had already begun to form their opinions, and many were eager to hear what he had to say. The officer, now under intense scrutiny, faced a difficult decision. How would he respond? Would he defend his actions or admit to making a mistake? The first officer, who had initially stopped the woman, decided to release his own statement. He knew that the situation had been blown out of proportion, but he still believed he had been acting within his rights. The officer's statement was much shorter than the woman's, and it seemed more defensive in tone. I did not recognize the woman during the traffic stop. I was just doing my job and following procedure, the officer wrote. He explained that he had acted based on what he knew at the time, and he believed that his actions were justified. He admitted that he had been caught off guard when the second officer pointed out who she was, but he still stood by his decision to proceed as he did. I never intended to disrespect anyone. I am simply a law enforcement officer doing my duty, he added. The officer's words seemed rehearsed, and he stuck to the idea that he had been following the rules, despite the clear misunderstanding. While his statement was calm, it didn't seem to do much to calm the growing storm. Some people defended him, suggesting that it wasn't unusual for an officer to act based on procedure, especially if he hadn't recognized the person in question. Others, however, felt that his lack of awareness and his harsh approach showed a lack of respect, both for the woman and for the situation at hand. The public response to the officer's statement was mixed. Some sympathized with him, understanding that being an officer can be stressful and that mistakes happen. However, many people still felt that he should have handled the situation differently. They pointed out that the officer had ignored the woman's words and escalated the encounter too quickly. In the eyes of many, it wasn't just about the officer's actions. It was about the bigger issue of how certain individuals were treated differently, simply because of their appearance or the assumptions others made about them. Despite the mixed reactions, one thing became clear. The officer's response was not enough to put the issue to rest. It had only added fuel to the fire. The woman's statement had been powerful and clear, but the officer's response felt more like a defense of his actions rather than an acknowledgement of the bigger conversation that had been sparked. The incident had opened up a larger discussion about respect, fairness, and accountability. People were now focused on how these types of situations could be prevented in the future. Was it enough to simply say, "I was doing my job"? Or did officers need to do more, to be more aware, more understanding, and more thoughtful in their interactions with the public? For the officer, the pressure was mounting. His reputation had been damaged, and the weight of the situation was sinking in. He had learned that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences reach much further than expected. In the end, the officer's response didn't provide the closure many had hoped for. Instead, it left people with more questions. What would happen next? Would the officer be held accountable for his actions? And more importantly, what would society learn from this experience? The woman, meanwhile, had already moved forward. She had used her voice to speak out, and she knew that the conversation had just begun. The road to change was never easy, but she was ready to continue using her position to help bring about the respect and understanding that everyone deserved. The fallout from the incident continued to echo throughout the community and beyond. The story of the traffic stop and the public reaction to it had brought issues of respect, authority, and fairness into the spotlight. The woman, though still shaken by the experience, began to feel a sense of responsibility to keep the conversation going. She knew that this moment, while deeply personal, was also part of a larger picture. It wasn't just about her. This was a reminder of the struggles many people faced daily when it came to bias and respect from authority figures. Her statement had encouraged people to think about how assumptions and prejudices could impact someone's life, and now she hoped that the public would keep those conversations alive. As the days went by, the officer's situation became more complicated. The department continued its internal review of the incident, and many people were asking what actions would be taken. The officer was not without support. Some believed that he had acted out of ignorance, not malice, and that he deserved a chance to learn from his mistake. Others, however, felt that the officer had failed in his duty to serve and protect, especially when it came to showing basic respect to a citizen, regardless of their role or position. The department, while acknowledging the mistake, did not immediately take drastic action. Instead, they announced plans for additional training and workshops focused on racial sensitivity, bias, and how to de-escalate situations. The woman, though appreciative of the effort, couldn't help but feel that action spoke louder than words. Training could only go so far if it wasn't truly implemented with an open mind and heart. In the meantime, the woman focused on her work, returning to her duties as a judge. She didn't want to let this one experience define her or her career, but she also understood that the lessons learned from it could help guide future actions. She knew that people were watching, both her and the officer, and that her role now extended beyond the courtroom. She began to speak publicly about her experience, not out of anger, but with the hope that her voice would inspire change. She spoke about the importance of human connection, the need to see each other as individuals first, not based on assumptions or appearances. Her message resonated with many, and she received messages of support from all corners of the country. Many people, both black and white, expressed how much they appreciated her calm, measured response, and her willingness to use her position for a greater good. For her, the incident had served as a wake-up call. While she had always been aware of the challenges faced by people of color in different settings, this experience had shown her how quickly things could spiral out of control when communication broke down. It reminded her of the importance of leadership, patience, and empathy in the roles we all play. Meanwhile, the officer found himself reflecting on the events, and over time, he began to understand the weight of his actions. It became clear to him that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a learning opportunity. He realized that the lack of awareness and the assumptions he had made could have been avoided with a little more attention and respect for the person in front of him. He knew he had to do better, not only for his career but for the community he swore to serve. As the weeks passed, both the woman and the officer took different paths toward growth. The woman, through her courage and voice, had helped bring attention to the need for greater understanding between the public and those who were entrusted to serve them. The officer, though still learning from his mistake, had come to realize that the journey toward change was not always easy, but it was necessary. The aftermath of the incident wasn't just a moment in time. It was a turning point. It wasn't about blaming anyone. It was about learning, growing, and doing better. The woman knew that true change would take time, but she was willing to be a part of that change, one step at a time. And in doing so, she hoped others would be inspired to join her in making the world a more respectful and understanding place. As the months went by, the story of the traffic stop faded from the headlines, but the lessons it taught continued to resonate. The woman, now well known for her calm and dignified handling of the situation, continued her work as a judge with renewed purpose. She knew that her experience had opened up a conversation that needed to happen, and she was determined to keep that conversation alive. Though the incident had been difficult, she found strength in the support she had received from the public. She received letters from all across the country, many from people who shared their own stories of being treated unfairly or misunderstood. They thanked her for using her platform to speak out and for showing the world the importance of respect and understanding. It made her realize how powerful her voice could be, not just in the courtroom, but in the broader world as well. The officer, too, had been on a journey since that day. The department's training and the discussions that followed had prompted him to reflect deeply on his actions. He had taken responsibility for his part in the incident, and he began to understand how important it was to approach every situation with empathy, awareness, and respect. He knew that his actions that day had been a mistake, but he also knew that learning from that mistake could make him a better officer and a better person. Over time, he became more proactive in working with community groups to build better relationships between law enforcement and the people they served. It was a slow process, but he felt that he was making progress, one step at a time. As the woman continued her work, she found herself becoming more involved in community outreach programs. She spoke at schools, at community centers, and at public events, sharing her story and urging others to think about the impact of their actions. She talked about the importance of empathy, of taking a moment to understand the person in front of you, and of challenging the assumptions that often lead to misunderstandings. Her words were powerful because they were rooted in experience. She didn't just speak about fairness and respect. She had lived through a moment that had tested those values. Her message was clear. We all have a role to play in creating a more just and understanding society. It wasn't enough to simply expect change. We all had to work for it, step by step. The officer's transformation didn't go unnoticed. Over time, his colleagues began to see the change in him. He was more thoughtful in his interactions with the community, and he made an effort to listen more carefully and respond with understanding. His shift wasn't dramatic, but it was real. He knew that the work of building trust and respect would take time, but he was committed to doing better, and he felt proud to be part of a growing movement toward positive change. The woman's experience had taught her that change didn't happen overnight. It took time, it took effort, and it took people being willing to learn from their mistakes. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. And as she continued her work, she knew that she was helping to build a world where people treated one another with the dignity and respect they deserved. By the end of the year, the woman and the officer had both grown in different ways. They hadn't forgotten the incident that had brought them into the spotlight, but they had used it as a stepping stone toward a greater understanding of each other and the world around them. The judge had found peace in knowing that her voice had sparked change, and the officer had found peace in knowing that his mistakes had led him to become a better person. Together, they showed that no matter how difficult or uncomfortable a situation may seem, it could be a moment of growth, learning, and progress. And in the end, that was the most important lesson of all.